Hey guys, welcome to the Filipino American Ministry Podcast. I'm your host, Henrik, and this is my co host, Aaron. And today we're going to be talking about the struggles of Filipino American Millennials, Gen Z, the second generation. And these are struggles that need more attention in our Filipino American churches. So I hope you are blessed by this. To start off, I think something that I would like the first generation to know about second gen. And what I mean by that is what we wanted our parents to know that we were going through was that we go through identity crisis, like our ethnic identity. I think we talked about this a little bit in our previous episodes, but I think, I don't know if Aaron experienced this, but for me, what happened and what I've seen also happen in other Asian American churches is that the second generation, they feel that in their ethnic context, like in the Filipino American church, they don't feel at home that they are truly Filipino. So among their Filipino parents or titos, titas, they don't feel that they are Filipino. But then at the same time, when they go to their American schools, they don't feel sometimes that they are actually American. I think it depends on the demographic. So if you're in a more diverse demographic, maybe it's easier for them to feel at home in an American public school. But like for me, I went to school in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and when I was young, I didn't feel like I fit in because most of my classmates were white. So there was that identity crisis that I had, is like, am I Filipino or am I American? And I think it was only until I was in my later 20s that I finally came to this understanding that I'm Filipino American. So I think that's one thing that would be good for Filipino American churches to address. There's this ministry called Epic, and in one of the conferences that Aaron and I went to, they talked about that tension between that identity struggle, that tension, and I think it was really helpful because I think that was my first opening to the understanding that my ethnic identity is Asian American. So they were able to talk about the Asian American struggle, the things that Asian Americans go through. And I think that was my first time starting to identify as Asian American, even though it's pretty obvious that I'm Asian American. But I think that was like a good conference that we went to. So I think that's something that maybe our Filipino American churches, it'd be great for them to understand that and be able to speak to that.
All right, so just kind of trying to understand where you're coming from here. Why was this so helpful for you? I mean, didn't you not know that you were Filipino American growing up?
I knew I was Filipino American, but I didn't know that Filipino American or Asian American was a thing. Like I didn't know that was a ethnic identity that I could identify with. So it was always like, am I Filipino or am I American?
Oh, is it like you didn't know that was a separate category?
Yeah,
you always had to like, it's either you were choose like a Filipino category or like American.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know that was a category that had its own struggles and its own identity. Because for me, it was always like, it's like I'm a mixture of Filipino and a mixture of American. But there's actually a category called Filipino American that I wasn't aware of, or in a category called Asian American that I wasn't aware of. And when people started talking about Asian American struggles, then I was like, oh, that sounds like what I go through. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So is it helpful only in the sense that there is a way to categorize what you were going through, or was it more helpful in the sense that you knew other people were going through the same thing?
I think the answer is both. So you said, what was the first one you said?
Like the first one was that there's there's finally like a category that I guess encapsulates what you're going through
Yeah, I think,
or like your experience.
yeah, because I think like when I was growing up, I only heard about Filipinos, and then I heard about Americans, but I didn't
Yeah,
hear of
so
that category.
I see. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out like how this was so helpful because I can't, like right now, I can't wrap my mind around like young Henrik, how this, I guess, idea or thought came to be so helpful for you as a Filipino American, like as a second generation.
Yeah, so I guess I give an example. Like at the Asian or the Epic conference, this is an ethnic or not ethnic, but this is a ministry that's for Asian Americans.
Yeah,
And that was my first time going to a conference where they were trying to address Asian American struggles. Like one of them was, and I don't necessarily relate to this, but one of them was the Asian Americans. They struggle with feeling like their parents have never told them that they love them. Um, and then that was something that Asian Americans, um, that's something they talked about at the conference. And then it was like, I guess for me, like whenever I go to a conference, it has always been like an American conference. So they don't talk about that problem with of Asian Americans. And they also talked about the identity struggle, being Asian and then being American. I think at that time I didn't even know that I had that struggle until I was at that conference. Um, and then when I was at the conference, they were talking about the struggle between identifying as Asian versus identifying as American. Then it kind of like it made it more concrete that that's something that I was actually going through, but I didn't know that I was going through it. You know what I mean?
yeah. I guess in order to solve something, you got to know what's going on. So, like, how would this help new Filipino Americans like, growing up at church?
Yeah, because I think like the youth in the youth ministry, I think they don't know that they can have this feeling of not feeling at home with Filipinos and not have feeling at home with Americans to some extent. To some extent, I mean, of course, like if you're with your titos, you do feel at home, but there's also an extent where they make you feel sometimes that you don't necessarily understand their culture. So I think when you ask my youth kids if they go through the identity struggle, they would say no sometimes. When I was exposed to ethnic Asian American ministry topics like this, then it opened my eyes that I was going through this struggle.
I mean, I do think that having a place to belong is even just that feeling of belonging is very important. I don't know if you've heard that term like third culture. It kind of expresses what we're talking about here. Have you heard that?
I've heard it from you, but maybe for our viewers or listeners, could you explain that?
It was a term used a lot by missionary kids or for missionary kids.
Oh,
So
okay.
missionaries would go to a different country, bring their kids with them. They're still young. So let's say like an American family goes to Indonesia. Their kids basically grow up in Indonesia. Maybe they're white, right? So they're white on the outside, but on the inside and culturally, they're Indonesian.
Mm.
But then they still come back to America once in a while. So they're Indonesian in culture, but they're not fully accepted there because they look different. They come to America, they look maybe white, but like they can't really relate as much to the culture because they didn't really grow up here. So like
Okay.
that kind of that's why it's called like third culture because there's that absence of, well, a part of the of being third culture is that absence of like of a home. Like you don't know where home is,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you know. And I think maybe that's what you're referring to is as a Filipino American and you don't fit in a purely Filipino context, I mean, you can. I think that's the good thing about Filipinos is we generally are able to fit well and adapt well, but still like that feeling of complete belonging, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Like you don't really fit well in a Filipino first generation context, and you don't really fit so well in even just an American context. Yeah, I think it's just important to recognize that second generation is a different culture
Oh yeah,
altogether.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think if you start there, um, that would definitely help. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Maybe because like even with Filipino parents, there's this thing about you know you're proud of where you came from, and you want to make sure you teach your children about your culture, and you want your kids to know your culture. But I think that's the problem with that is, your kids obviously are growing up here in the US, a different culture. And in reality, at least from what I've seen in most Filipino American churches, is their kids don't even speak the heart language. And
Yeah.
so, if you don't understand the language, it's going to be hard to understand the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this desire within first generation Filipinos to have their kids understand their culture, even be proud of their culture. And I think a lot of Filipino second gens are,
Mm-hmm.
but it's just not to the level as first gen, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it's good to at least recognize that these kids, sure, they look Filipino, they have brown skin, but they're not first gen, right? Like they don't have the same kind of cultural understanding, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we can teach it to them, but like I guess like the shared norms, the shared cultural expectations
Mm-hmm.
is not always there. So, for example, in a first gen, within first generations, you have these norms, these shared expectations of how you should behave when you're with other Filipinos. Like, for example, there's an older person there, you give way to the older person,
Mm-hmm.
right? Even when it comes to authority or to speaking or who gets to talk or who gets to pray or, those kind of things. Like, even though they're very subtle sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
can't really expect that all the time when it comes to like second gen. I mean, there's other issues too, not just that. I mean, you can teach that, but it's kind of like I guess the way that I would think about it is like first generation maybe is built off of like Windows
Windows.
system, and then like
Oh, okay. Okay.
second gen is built off of OS, right? Like
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
some commonalities, but in their core, they're different.
Yeah. It's a different OS.
Yeah, it's a different like operating system,
Right.
right? So, you know, there's things that overlap, right? They both can run a computer or something. I'm just trying to run off this analogy,
Yeah.
but at its core, they're like different.
Mm.
And I think that's kind of important to recognize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Definitely more awareness of the cultural differences is always good. Something I was going to add is something that I pushed for when I was leading the youth ministry was like having fellowship with other churches. So we mentioned this in a different episode, but I think having that fellowship with them, when you see other people from other churches going through similar identity struggles as you, or similar cultural or generational struggles that you're going through, it's helpful. So that's something that if you're in a Filipino American church and you only have 5 youth who are Filipino American, like second gen, millennial, Gen Z, or even below, even after that, something you can do is reach out to the other Filipino American churches and try to fellowship with them and have your kids fellowship with their kids. So that's something that I think that Filipino American churches can also do. And that's something that I enjoyed as a youth, seeing other Filipino Americans worshiping God. Like when we had a retreat back when I was like 11 to 14.
Yeah.
That was really helpful for me as a Filipino American, just seeing other Filipino Americans who are my age, who are worshiping God with such passion. And I think that that made an impression on me that like Christianity is not just for the Filipinos, but it's also for like Filipino Americans too. And just seeing them worshiping God made me have that understanding that God is also a God of Filipino Americans. So that's what I would say for like that identity is something that Filipino American churches can do. And you kind of highlighted this. Another thing that is needed, or for the second generation, another need for millennials and Gen Z, is I think they need to understand more the first generation, their thought process. They need more awareness of that thought process. Like,
I think that my analogy would go both ways, right? Like if you know you're an OS, if you just
Mac,
they're not like an OS, for example. They're like a different operating system.
Yeah.
So you can't just use your apps on their system.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work like that. I think.
That's a good analogy.
You have to kind of change how you deal with them. Cause like it's a different culture. The way I look at it is kind of like, I mean, it probably is not to that extent, but like you're going to a different culture. You can't, let's just say you go to like the Middle East or something, like a different country. You can't just bring your culture and expect that people would respond in the same way. Like you can't bring your operating system and then engage in your own operating system.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good analogy for the second gens who are listening. But yeah, I think the second generation and millennials, Gen Z, they need to understand how their parents think. Otherwise, I think this causes arguments and misunderstandings.
I think a lot of the potential problems could be minimized if there's just more conversations.
Yeah. You mentioned that
between two different generations.
Yeah, I think more conversations to get more understanding of the different generations. Yeah. I think as an example, like we're growing up in American culture and we see our friends dating, for example, but then our parents say things like, you cannot date until you're out of college. So the youth that I talk with, they're always confused about the dating rules of the first gen. So that having that dialogue, like you said, like if they were able to talk about it, they would, instead of just laying down the principle, like instead of laying down the rules, they should also talk about like the principles behind them. So in a Filipino American church context or in a ministry context, having the youth or the second generation understand the thought processes of the first gen would be very helpful.
I guess the next question would be like, how does this understanding come? We did talk about it a little bit, which is through more conversations. Yeah,
and also what I do with my youth is I try to tell them what I've learned. Like, like I mentioned this before, but like language. Like one of my youth kids, he was offended by the language of one of the adults. And what I told him was, What
was the language?
I said in the previous episode that one of the adults used the word overseeing.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Like for listeners who didn't listen to that episode, an adult was saying, "Oh, I'm plating this person to oversee you," and then, and then what the youth interpreted was like, oversee means like
He was incompetent.
yeah, he was incompetent and he needed someone to watch over him, like look behind his shoulder and watch him do everything that he's doing. So it carries with it there's no trust, and they don't trust you. They think you're incompetent. So what I did was I told my youth kid, you need to understand that the adults, English is not their first language. So sometimes the way that they talk to you, it might be offensive, but you need to remember they don't carry the same connotation. They don't have the same connotation when they use a word that you have. So
Yeah, and probably in their minds, it's not a bad thing to have someone to oversee, right? It's not because you're incompetent.
yeah,
They just want someone to guide you.
Yeah. When I spoke with the adult, he said he meant it for support. Like that was the connotation. Like the overseeing means like someone to support you, like if you need anything. So that's what I told him that. And later on, he has told me that like that understanding that if someone is English is not their first language, then you should give them more grace when they use words that are offensive. Because maybe he didn't mean for it to be offensive. He's just trying to translate what he thinks into English, and he doesn't know the cultural connotation behind certain words. Okay, so that's summarizing that. That's understanding how first generation thinks. I've definitely talked to my youth a lot. Like this is how the adults think. And these are things that I learned, and I think it's been helpful for them in terms of how to relate with the adults.
That kind of also translates into like the way you do ministries is different when you know they're different.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, it's helpful because it makes you think of other ways to do ministry. Like one of my pastor friends would say, like, I'm so good at like first generation, but when it comes to second gen, I just don't know like why I'm not effective.
Yeah. And actually, I kind of like talked about this with our church, and a lot of the adults, they go to me sometimes to understand the second gen. So like just having that awareness that the like Filipino American kids are different. I mean, it's not that hard to know, but they go to me to understand like how the youth think. Next thing I want to talk about is like for Filipino American millennials and Gen Z, what are some common struggles that they go through that I think that Filipino American churches should know? Mental health is like a big thing for Gen Z. Like if there were sermons about mental health and like learning how to say no to certain things, dealing with depression, dealing with suicidal thoughts, those are some topics that would be nice to hear about in church. Like in your Filipino American church, I think when I go to Filipino American churches, I always hear like the common Christian topics, but there's not much talk about mental health. And that's like being an emotionally healthy, spiritual Christian is something that is very useful that I think Filipino churches should incorporate in their churches.
So you're saying that Gen Zs and millennials have a higher risk or have more mental, like that is a more prevalent problem in these generations.
Yeah, and also like with adults, they don't. Sometimes their kids say that they're sad or they're dealing with depression, but then the adults kind of rub it off. Because I don't know, like how. I mean, I don't know how the adults are thinking, but in my experience, I've seen adults say, "Oh, you're not sad. You don't need counseling. You're okay." Like they don't see that that's a big issue for the second gen. But a lot of times, second gen, they actually need counselors to process the things that they're going through. And that's something that I was going to talk about later on in the episode. Just having that idea that counseling is an option is helpful.
Wait, so do you see this a lot in your youth group?
Yeah. So like, see what a lot, like the mental health issues or.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in my church, I think some of the adults are really good. Like they do have counselors. They do actually have their kids go to counselors when they need it. So that's really good on them for the adults who do that. But I've heard some stories where the first generation Filipinos, they don't take it as a serious thing when a youth opens up about their emotional struggles, like they're being sad or depressed or suicidal, not eating because of weight issues. Like another thing too is like, speaking of weight, like adults, they always say, "Oh, you got fat," when like as a greeting, right? But actually with the
That's
second,
offensive to Americans.
yeah, that's offensive to American kids. Like they always go to a Filipino party and the tita says, "Oh, you got fatter," or like, or "You're so fat now." But that's something that they go like they actually refrain from eating. They have eating disorders because of those kinds of comments, and I think that's something that Filipino American first gen should be aware of. And
hey, what's up? You got fat.
that happened to you, right? When you visited us.
I don't remember.
I remember.
Goes in one ear and out the other.
Maybe you're used to it, but I remember one of the titas said, "Oh, you're fatter now. You got fatter." Yeah. So I think, yeah, that mental health issues.
That's kind of interesting, because like, I mean, there's times when I hear my parents joke about this, like with their friends, like, you got fat, and they say, "Oh yeah, progress." Like I'm having more progress in life. That's why I got like fatter or something like that. Different mentality, different system.
So the first generation doesn't get offended when they say that to each other? They know?
No.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, just going back to the initial topic about like mental health, there's a book called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Pete Scazzero. And that was really, and I've seen other Asian American churches, they have that book. That author, he created a curriculum about being an emotionally healthy Christian. And I think that's something that it would be nice for Filipino American churches to be talking about. I mean, being emotionally healthy and having a high emotional IQ is something that would be good for the millennials and Gen Z. So that's something that they struggle with, like emotional mental health.
That's really interesting, because in the Philippines, bad things happen, like typhoons and everything. You know how like Filipinos are known to like smile through adversity, and biggest typhoon comes and they're still smiling and they're okay or something like that. I wonder if that's where the first generation is coming from. They're like, they're gonna just go through it and they're gonna be okay.
Oh, okay.
I don't know, but maybe there's a lot of underlying issues that happens. I think the good thing about like first gen Filipinos is they really know how to have like, I guess, that barkada system, like that deep friendship.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it could be a generational thing. Like, I think maybe millennials and Gen Z, because they're living in an information age and social media, they grew up with social media. So
yeah,
this is not a issue that's specific to Filipino Americans, millennials, but it's an issue for all millennials and all Gen Z, is that feeling, even in the social media generation, they deal with loneliness and
You
mental
think? Oh,
health.
you're saying that social media is exacerbating or just making it worse?
I'm not. I'm not saying that social. Yeah, well, maybe that's what I'm saying. But like, for example, there's a Facebook group called Subtle Asian Mental Health, and it just shows, like, when I read the comments on there and like the posts, like people are posting every day about their mental health issues and like things that they're going through, and I think that's a big need for millennials and Gen Z, just mental health. And I've seen it with my youth. Like mental health is something that they really care about. And yeah.
Okay, so what does like a mentally healthy church look like?
A mentally healthy church? Well, I think that's a good question, and I think it'd be good to reference Pete Scazzero. But one thing, for example, is learning how to say no is something that I learned. Like I think in some churches they have this desire for people to serve so much, especially in small churches, and like I guess the helping youth to, I think like for me growing up, it was hard for me to learn to say no. Like when an adult comes up to me and says that they need me to do this, or like and a lot of times it's like I'm the only one who could do it. Sometimes like they would ask me to do something and then I'm the only one who could actually do it, and I'm the best person to do it. So I feel that pressure of like, if I don't do it, then who's going to do it? So I think learning to say no when you're really busy, or that's something that would be healthy. Like if we could cultivate an environment or culture in our churches that it's okay to say no when it's okay to say no when you don't want to do something. That's a start for an emotionally healthy church.
I do notice that in small Filipino American churches, a lot of the like staff or worship team are just the kids.
Oh yeah,
You know, like every week
are
are the young people.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that. I remember my friend. He's Chinese. He was like the worship leader of his church.
Even in our church growing up, it's like a lot of it is young people led.
Yeah. Do you think that's not a healthy thing? Like emotionally healthy?
No. I'm not saying it's unhealthy.
Oh, you're just noticing.
I'm just saying that like usually they're like quite involved in that. Maybe they enjoy it.
In worship. Yeah. Well, I think that's something that is easy for the youth to pick up, like playing guitar and leading worship.
I guess what I'm saying is like if the kids don't know how to say no, then they would have burnout. I mean, I've experienced burnout too, but
yeah, I think burnout is something that's something that which could be discussed more in Filipino churches too.
Yes, I'm trying to understand this mental health issue. What does that look like in the second gen? Like, if I was a Tito and you're trying to make me understand this issue, and what would you say to make me understand this issue?
Yeah, okay.
Where I don't just go say, well, you'll be okay. It's just a season.
Yeah. That's hard. I mean, I'm imagining talking to Tito and trying to convince him that this is an issue.
Because I know I could definitely see it, right? That it could be a problem because, again, they are working through a different system and they see this and they're like, you know, I've been there. I've been sad too, but I'm okay.
Yeah. So how would you explain that to a Tito who, especially they've probably gone through more adversity, right? Or
that's right. Like, how would you show me the importance of this? I guess.
I think it's easier for me to go to adults who are more open to this idea first. There are some adults in my church who are more listening and more trying to be understanding. So I would go to them first to help them understand this, and then when I find first generation adults who understand the mental health thing, then they can explain it to that kind of person. But right off the
But
top,
I do want you to explain to me because I want to understand it more.
okay.
It's like with our youth group, right? I mean, I know we went through some like drama and stuff like that, and I know people who've gone to our youth group that had mental health issues that were really bad.
Yeah, I think mental health, it's like, I think to help you understand, like if you were a Tito who was trying to understand, I would say like mental health has nothing to do with the material aspect. Like you can be rich, you can have everything you want materially, but then like there are emotional needs that you need, like being affirmed or encouraged, having community, having friends. That's an emotional need. And mental health issues for millennials and Gen Z looks like they're going through peer pressure, or they're going through rejection from their friend group, or they feel like an outcast in their friend group. So they don't feel, so even though their physical needs are met, they have food, they have electronics, they have laptops, internet, but they don't have close friendships. Or even if they do have close friendships, they deal with like a lot of pressure to keep those friendships. Yeah, knowing how to navigate those kinds of issues, like those emotional issues, would be helpful for their mental health. Otherwise, they'll go through depression, and when they go through depression, it leads to them feeling like they're not worthy of friendships. They feel like they're not worthy of being loved by others, and they go through shame. So does that help, or are you more confused?
Yeah, but I've gone through those too.
Yeah,
If I was a Tito, I'd say something like that.
So that's annoying.
But maybe you hit a point there. I'm not sure if this is a case by case thing or generational thing, but you mentioned about like maybe the lack of deep friendships. Is that something that you see in younger kids?
I think they have deep friendships, but they don't. I think they either scared to lose their deep friendships, or they feel that something they've done has been too disgusting and gross that they couldn't open up to their deep friendships about it.
They need different sets of friends. If I'm just kidding.
but I think maybe I don't know. Like maybe this is controversial to say, but if the Tito who says like, well, I went through that too, but I'm okay. Well, I think what I would say is, I guess from the second generation perspective, is you went through it, but you didn't deal with it emotionally, in an emotionally healthy way. Like there's still some deep seated, like maybe you just became numb to it, and then you didn't fully, you didn't really process it in a healthy way. Is how like.
It's the Tito who would sing karaoke, and then when he's drunk and starts crying and just singing out loud.
But, yeah. So I mean, that's something. Yeah, I guess I would say maybe the Tito didn't deal with it in a healthy way yet, and that's why he doesn't see the need for mental health. Because he hasn't dealt with it, or he hasn't had a counselor to talk about those issues with. So he doesn't see the benefit of having a counselor. Is what I would say. Yeah, but I mean that's kind of offensive to say. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's how like a second gen would think. Like, you say that you went through it, but did you process it well? Is that what I would say?
Well, I think in general, what we're trying to say here is it would be better for our kids to be emotionally healthy, right? And if we've gone through some hard stuff, then let's teach our kids how to process those things,
Yeah.
in a healthy way.
And it's not just like in a healthy way, but in a biblical way too. Like how to deal with rejection from, like, how does the gospel speak to rejection? That's always a good thing to discuss. That's something that I always emphasize when I teach youth.
And it's not a bad thing to be pastoral and to ask, like, how are you doing? How's life? Even those little conversations can go a long way.
You mean with the adults versus to youth?
Yeah. When I was in college, I think, right when I started meeting with my mentor, all we did was I would go to his house, we'd sit down, face to face, and he's like, "What's going on?" Then we just start talking. It's more of like a life on life kind of conversation. That was really helpful for me at that time. It helps me process things that I'm going through and what I'm thinking about. I think in general, it's just really helpful to have these moments of pastoral care, of just like, "Hey, how are you doing?" Those kind of things.
Yeah. I think something I would want to talk about in the future is like, how do you, because I've seen instances where the adults would say, they ask these questions, but it's only surface level. Like the youth would answer the questions like, "Oh yeah, I'm doing good," and then the adult would say, "Oh, how's school?" And then the youth would say,
usually it's like school and stuff like that.
Yeah, and then the youth would say, "Oh, school's good," and then well, it doesn't progress any further. So how do you break that to make it more deep?
I actually remember we would have these lock-ins at my house.
Yeah.
And it's always interesting because that's where some of the deep conversations tend to happen.
Yeah. But that would be between our generation, though. That wouldn't really involve the first gen.
Yeah, but still, it's a place where the second gen do get to open up.
Yeah,
Yeah, interesting. Today, actually, I'm calling a friend of mine later and asking him about mentorship. Just something that he's been doing for a while. So I've been trying to, because we're trying to do some mentorship with some people at our church, and we're trying to figure out what mentorship would look like. At least for me, for it to be effective, is you sit down, you have a meal together, and you ask beyond the surface, like what you were mentioning.
Meals.
No, not just meals, but like the conversation you ask beyond just the surface questions of how's school.
Oh, okay.
But like, my thinking is that like we would get together because they're younger than us, and start off with just asking how they're doing and truly listening to them. I think most of it is that, like, just listening to what they're saying, and if there's something that I can share, then I would.
Yeah. Okay, so I think it's we've been talking for almost an hour, so we still have more to talk about, but I think we'll put it off to another episode. So this is part 1 about what are the common struggles, needs of Filipino American millennials, Gen Z, and the second gen. We hope you like what we talked about today. Be sure to like our podcast, subscribe, and if you have any feedback or anything that you were offended by or you didn't agree with or something to add, it would be great for you to chime in the discussion, and we're pretty open-minded, so we're still learning this ourselves. We don't claim to be the experts, but it would be great to hear from our audience. Thank you.
Peace.